I still remember the cold slam of the door behind him, 5 years ago, like it was yesterday. My own son walked out, without a backward glance, leaving me alone in this tiny, cluttered Queens apartment that smells like old newspapers and lost dreams. The silence that followed felt like death itself. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, though most people call me Maggie. I'm 72 years old, and I've lived in this same cramped apartment in Astoria, Queens, for almost 30 years. The wallpaper is peeling in the corners, the refrigerator makes that rattling sound that keeps me awake at night, and the floorboards creak every time I walk to the bathroom. But this place holds every memory I have of raising my son David. Every scraped knee I bandaged at that kitchen table. Every homework assignment we struggled through under that flickering overhead light. Every birthday cake I baked in that ancient oven that never heated evenly. Every morning, I wake up before dawn. Not because I want to, but because sleep doesn't come easy when your heart carries this much weight. The city noises filter through my cracked window, sirens in the distance, the grinding of garbage trucks, the steady hum of traffic on the BQE. The loneliness nestles in my bones like winter cold that never quite leaves. I shuffle through my routine, microwaving instant coffee because my arthritis makes holding heavy pots painful, slowly folding the same 3 loads of laundry because it gives me something to do with my hands, and staring at that framed photograph on my dresser. The photo shows David when he was 8 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, standing beside me at the Central Park Zoo. I remember that day so clearly. We'd spent our last $20 on admission tickets and hot dogs. I wore my best dress, a blue sundress I'd bought at the thrift shop on Northern Boulevard. David wore the Superman t-shirt I'd saved up 3 weeks to buy him. In the photo, his small hand is clasped in mine, and we're both laughing at something the photographer said. That little boy loved me completely. Unconditionally. With the pure, uncomplicated love that only children can give. 5 years ago, I thought that photo represented our forever. I thought the bond between a mother and her child was unbreakable, sacred, eternal. I thought all those years of sacrifice and devotion had built something permanent between us. But life had other plans. Last week, after 5 years of silence, David knocked on my door. No warning. No phone call. No apologies for the years of abandonment. Just him, standing in my doorway in his expensive suit, holding an envelope and making an offer that shattered everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the son I raised with every breath in my body. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here. Let me tell you about the sacrifices that built the foundation of this story. Because understanding what I gave requires understanding what I lost. David's father, Robert, left when David was 4 years old. Just walked out one Tuesday morning while David was eating his Cheerios and I was getting ready for my nursing shift at Brooklyn Methodist Hospital. Robert said he needed space, needed to find himself, needed to explore who he was without the burden of a family weighing him down. Those were his exact words, the burden of a family. As if David and I were heavy stones around his neck instead of hearts that beat in rhythm with his. I remember standing in our tiny kitchen, still holding my coffee mug, watching Robert pack his clothes while David asked why Daddy was putting everything in suitcases. I told David that Daddy was going on a long trip. I didn't have the heart to tell a 4-year-old that sometimes the people who promise to love you forever decide that forever is too long. After Robert left, it was just me and David against the world. I worked double shifts at the hospital, sometimes 16 hours straight, coming home with feet so swollen I had to soak them in Epsom salt baths. My back ached from lifting patients twice my size. My eyes burned from reading charts under fluorescent lights. But every paycheck, every overtime hour, every minute of exhaustion was worth it because it meant David could have what he needed. I remember the sacrifices like scars on my hands. Each one a mark of love, a testament to devotion, a price I was willing to pay without question. When David needed new school clothes, I bought them and wore my old dresses until they had more patches than original fabric. When David wanted to join the soccer team, I paid the registration fee and worked an extra weekend shift to cover it. When David got sick and needed medication, I bought it even if it meant eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner for a week. I raised him in this apartment, in this neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business. Mrs. Rodriguez from 3B would bring us leftover rice and beans when she cooked too much. Mr. Kowalski from across the hall would help David with his math homework when I was working late. The bodega owner, Hassan, would let David pick out a candy bar on credit when I was between paychecks. We were a community, a family of neighbors who took care of each other. David grew up here, in these streets. He played stickball in the courtyard, rode his bike to the corner store, learned to navigate the subway system like a native New Yorker. He was street smart and book smart, tough enough to handle the city but tender enough to cry when he watched sad movies with me on our old couch. When David graduated high school, I was so proud I cried through the entire ceremony. He'd been accepted to Columbia University with a partial scholarship. The rest of the tuition, nearly $40,000 a year, would be my responsibility. I didn't hesitate. I took out loans. I worked extra shifts. I sold the few pieces of jewelry my mother had left me. I did whatever it took because David's education, David's future, David's dreams were worth any sacrifice. "Mom, I need $500 for my business ethics project," he'd say, calling from his dorm room freshman year. I'd send it, even though it meant I couldn't afford to fix the leak in my bathroom ceiling that winter. "Mom, my laptop crashed and I need a new one for my computer science classes," he'd say sophomore year. I'd send $800, even though it meant I ate instant ramen for 2 months to make up the difference. "Mom, there's this networking event in Manhattan and I need a good suit to make the right impression," he'd say junior year. I'd send $300, even though I'd been wearing the same winter coat for 5 years. Every request, I fulfilled without question. Every need, I met without hesitation. Because that's what mothers do. We give everything we have and then find ways to give more. But somewhere during those college years, something changed. The boy who used to call me every day started calling once a week, then once a month. The son who used to tell me about his friends, his classes, his hopes and fears started giving me one-word answers when I asked about his life. "How are your classes going, sweetheart?" "Fine. Are you making friends?" "Yeah." "Are you eating enough?" "Mom, I'm fine. Everything's fine." But nothing felt fine. The distance between us grew like a chasm I couldn't cross. When I'd suggest visiting him on campus, he'd find excuses. When I'd invite him home for dinner, he'd be too busy studying. When I'd ask about his plans after graduation, he'd change the subject. During his senior year, David started a tech company with 2 classmates. It was something about app development and digital marketing, things I didn't understand but tried to learn about because they mattered to him. He was passionate about it, more excited than I'd seen him since he was a little boy building elaborate Lego castles on our living room floor. "Mom, this is going to be big," he'd say during one of his rare phone calls. "We're going to change how people interact with technology. We're going to revolutionize the entire industry." His enthusiasm was infectious. I felt proud that my son, the little boy I'd raised in this small apartment, was dreaming such big dreams. I wanted to support those dreams any way I could. "I need an investment to get the company off the ground," he said during a brief visit home that spring. He was standing in our kitchen, but he seemed to fill less space somehow, as if he'd already outgrown this place, outgrown me. "Just $25,000 to cover our startup costs." "It's not a loan, Mom. It's an investment. You'll get it back tenfold when we make it big." $25,000. It was my entire retirement savings. Every penny I'd managed to set aside from my nursing salary over 25 years of working. It was my security blanket, my insurance against an uncertain future, my only protection against poverty in my old age. But it was David asking. My son. The child I'd given everything to. The young man whose dreams I'd supported every step of the way. "Of course, sweetheart," I said without hesitation. "Whatever you need." I went to the bank the next day and withdrew my entire retirement account. I handed David the check with a smile, with pride, with the absolute certainty that I was helping my son build his future. He hugged me, the first real hug he'd given me in months, and promised that this investment would change both our lives. "I love you, Mom," he said as he folded the check into his wallet. "This means everything to me. I won't forget this." Those were the last loving words my son spoke to me. After graduation, David's company took off exactly as he'd predicted. Within 2 years, they'd developed an app that connected small businesses with customers in their local area. It was simple, effective, and perfectly timed for the growing trend of supporting local commerce. The app exploded in popularity, especially after they secured partnerships with major retail chains. I learned about David's success the way everyone else did, through news articles and social media posts. I'd see headlines about young tech entrepreneurs revolutionizing local commerce and recognize my son's name among the founders. I'd read about their $1 million funding rounds, their expanding team, their plans for national expansion. I'd study photographs of David at industry conferences and networking events, looking polished and confident in expensive suits I'd never seen before. But I never heard from him directly. He never called to share his good news. He never visited to celebrate his success with the woman who'd made it all possible. He never acknowledged my investment or offered to pay me back as he'd promised. "You're always working," he'd snapped at me once during college when I'd missed one of his phone calls because I was pulling a double shift. It was cruel and dismissive, as if my work, the work that paid for his education, his food, his dreams, was somehow an inconvenience to him. Other conversations played in my mind like broken records, each one more painful in retrospect. "You don't understand my world, Mom," he'd said during his junior year, when I'd asked about the pressure he was under. "Your generation just doesn't get how complicated things are now." I'd nodded and swallowed the sting of his words, telling myself that he was young, stressed, finding his way in a complex world. But now I wondered if those words revealed something deeper. Did he see me as outdated, irrelevant, too simple to understand his sophisticated life? Was I a mother to him, or just a wallet that opened whenever he needed something? The doubts crept in slowly, like water finding cracks in a foundation. Was his love conditional on what I could provide? Did he care about me as a person, or just as a source of financial support? Had I raised a son who loved me, or a stranger who used me? As the months passed without contact, the questions multiplied. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd failed somehow. Had I been too giving? Too accommodating? Had I taught him that my love came without expectations, without boundaries, without the requirement of basic respect? I started noticing things I'd missed before. How he'd always had excuses when I needed help. How he'd always been too busy when I was sick or lonely. How our conversations had always centered on what he needed rather than how I was doing. How he'd accepted every sacrifice I made without question, as if it was his due rather than my gift. The realization grew slowly, painfully, like a splinter working its way deeper into tender flesh. I had raised my son to see me not as a person with my own needs and feelings, but as a resource to be accessed when convenient and ignored when not. 3 years passed without contact. 3 birthdays he forgot. 3 Christmases I spent alone, staring at gifts I'd bought for him that I never had the address to send. 3 years of checking my phone obsessively, hoping for a call that never came. 3 years of making extra food for dinner out of habit, then throwing it away when I remembered that my son was gone. The loneliness was crushing. It settled into my bones like arthritis, a constant ache that never quite went away. I'd catch myself listening for his key in the door, forgetting that he'd never had keys to any home but this one, and he'd given those back the day he left for college. I'd find myself buying his favorite snacks at the grocery store, then standing in my kitchen, holding a box of Pop-Tarts and crying because my son was gone and I didn't know how to stop being his mother. The neighborhood felt different too. Mrs. Rodriguez still brought me leftovers, but now her kind gestures felt like pity rather than community. Mr. Kowalski still said hello in the hallway, but I could see the questions in his eyes when he asked about David. Hassan at the bodega still smiled when I came in, but I could tell he'd heard the gossip about the successful son who'd abandoned his mother. Because people talk in neighborhoods like this. They notice when the family photos disappear from your refrigerator. They remember the young man they watched grow up, and they wonder why he never visits anymore. They whisper about the mother who gave everything and was left with nothing. The whispers hurt almost as much as the silence. I'd overhear conversations at the laundromat, at the grocery store, in the lobby of my building. "Did you hear about Maggie's boy? Made it big in Manhattan, they say. Lives in some fancy penthouse now. Never comes around anymore." The words would slice through me like knives, each one confirming what I already knew: my son had moved beyond me, beyond this place, beyond any need for the woman who'd raised him. But the worst part wasn't the gossip or the loneliness or even the financial strain of living on a nurse's pension after giving away my retirement savings. The worst part was the way hope kept creeping back in. Every time my phone rang, my heart would leap, thinking maybe this time it would be David. Every knock at my door made me think maybe he'd come home. Every holiday, every birthday, every anniversary of some shared memory, I'd convince myself that this would be the day he'd remember me, miss me, need me again. But the calls never came. The knocks were always the mailman or Mrs. Rodriguez or someone asking me to sign a petition. The holidays passed unmarked by any word from my son. I started having conversations with his photo, the one from Central Park where we're both so happy. I'd tell 8-year-old David about my day, about the weather, about the neighbors he used to know. I'd ask his opinion about what to watch on TV, what to make for dinner, whether I should finally replace the broken lamp in the living room. Sometimes I'd catch myself waiting for him to answer, forgetting that photos can't speak and children grow into strangers and love doesn't always last forever. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in February, almost 4 years after David had left. I'd caught pneumonia, not surprising, given that the heating in my building was unreliable and I couldn't afford to keep the apartment warm enough during one of the worst winters New York had seen in decades. I was sick for 2 weeks, sicker than I'd been since David was young, and I couldn't afford to be sick. Mrs. Rodriguez checked on me daily, bringing soup and tea and making sure I was taking my medication. She offered to call David for me, but I couldn't bear the thought of him coming out of obligation rather than love. I preferred his absence to his pity. On the 10th day of my illness, when I could barely get out of bed, David finally showed up. I don't know how he found out I was sick. Maybe Mrs. Rodriguez called him despite my protests, or maybe word had gotten back to him through some other channel. But there he was, standing in my doorway, looking uncomfortable and impatient, as if visiting his sick mother was an inconvenience he was eager to finish. He stayed for 20 minutes. 20 minutes out of a life he'd built over 4 years of silence. He asked if I needed anything, but in a way that suggested he hoped the answer was no. He looked at his phone constantly, as if there were urgent messages he needed to respond to. He didn't touch me, didn't sit on my bed, didn't offer any of the comfort that sick people crave from the ones they love. "I'm glad you're feeling better, Mom," he said as he prepared to leave, though I was clearly still very ill. "Take care of yourself. Take care of yourself." As if I hadn't been taking care of myself, and him, my entire adult life. As if self-care was some novel concept he was introducing to me instead of something I'd sacrificed for his sake over and over again. After he left, I lay in my bed and cried harder than I had since his father walked out. But these weren't tears of sadness or loneliness. These were tears of rage, of recognition, of a fury so pure it burned through the fever better than any medication. I finally understood what my son had become, what I had raised, what I had allowed him to turn into. I had spent 28 years loving a boy who had grown into a man incapable of loving me back. The 4th year of silence stretched into the 5th. By then, I'd stopped checking my phone for his calls. I'd stopped buying his favorite foods. I'd stopped making excuses for him when neighbors asked why he never visited. The hope that had sustained me through the early years of his abandonment had finally died, and in its place grew something I'd never felt toward my son before: anger. Not the quick flash of irritation that comes and goes, but a deep, burning anger that settled in my chest and refused to leave. Anger at him for taking everything I'd given and offering nothing in return. Anger at myself for allowing it to happen. Anger at the naive woman I'd been, who'd believed that sacrificial love would automatically be reciprocated, that giving everything meant getting something back. I started going to a support group for older adults at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Long Island City. It wasn't specifically for abandoned parents, but it attracted people dealing with various forms of loss and betrayal. There was Eleanor, whose husband of 40 years had left her for his secretary. There was Frank, whose children had put him in a nursing home and sold his house without asking his permission. There was Rosa, whose daughter had stolen her identity and run up thousands of dollars in credit card debt. Listening to their stories helped me understand that my situation wasn't unique. There were other parents who'd given everything and received nothing. Other people who'd confused selflessness with love and enabled the very behavior that ultimately destroyed their relationships. Other mothers and fathers struggling with the realization that the children they'd devoted their lives to had grown into adults who saw them as resources rather than people. "The hardest part," Eleanor said during one of our sessions, "is accepting that love doesn't guarantee love in return. That all the years of sacrifice and devotion don't create a debt that has to be repaid. That sometimes the people we love the most are the least capable of loving us back." Her words hit me like a physical blow, but they also carried a strange relief. For the first time since David had left, someone had put into words what I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. I hadn't failed as a mother because my son didn't love me. I had simply loved someone who wasn't capable of returning that love in the way I needed and deserved. The support group gave me tools I'd never had before. They taught me about boundaries, about the difference between helping and enabling, about the importance of self-worth that isn't dependent on other people's approval or affection. They helped me understand that saying no wasn't selfish, that protecting myself wasn't cruel, that demanding respect wasn't unreasonable. But understanding something intellectually and implementing it emotionally are two very different things. I could sit in that church basement every Tuesday evening and nod along with the wisdom being shared, but when I went home to my empty apartment, I still found myself hoping for a call that wouldn't come, still wondering if I'd somehow driven my son away through some failure of my own. The real test came 6 months later, when David called for the first time in over a year. It was a Saturday afternoon in October. I was watching a cooking show and folding laundry when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I'd gotten into the habit of letting calls go to voicemail because most of them were telemarketers anyway. But something made me pick up on the 4th ring. "Mom?" His voice was exactly the same, and hearing it transported me instantly back to all those years when that voice was the most important sound in my world. "David?" I could barely believe it was really him. "Yeah, it's me. Listen, I need to ask you a favor." Not, "How are you?" Not, "I'm sorry I haven't called." Not, "I've missed you," or "I think about you," or any of the words I'd been carrying around like wishes for 5 years. I need to ask you a favor. But my heart was still pounding from hearing his voice, and before I could stop myself, I was saying, of course, sweetheart. What do you need? I'm getting married, he said, and the words hit me like cold water. Her name is Amanda. She's from a really prominent family up in Connecticut, and we're having the wedding at her family's estate. The thing is, her parents are kind of traditional, and they want to meet my family before the ceremony. I waited for him to continue, my mind racing. He was getting married. My son, my only child, was getting married, and this was how I was finding out, not through an excited announcement or an invitation to celebrate, but as part of a request for a favor. The problem is, he continued, his voice taking on that impatient tone I remembered from his college calls, they're expecting to meet someone who looks the part, you know? Someone who fits in with their world. I know this is a lot to ask, but I was wondering if you could maybe spruce yourself up a bit for the meeting. Maybe get a nice outfit, do something with your hair, that kind of thing. The words kept coming, each one more devastating than the last. I know money's tight for you, so I'm prepared to give you $500 to cover the makeover. And maybe we could say you're retired from nursing administration instead of just being a floor nurse? These people really care about status and position, and I need to make the right impression. I couldn't speak. I literally couldn't form words. My son was asking me to pretend to be someone else so he wouldn't be embarrassed by the woman who'd raised him, supported him, sacrificed everything for him. He was offering to pay me to play a role in his life instead of just accepting me as I was. Mom? Are you there? I'm here, I managed to whisper. So what do you think? Can you do this for me? It would really mean a lot. What did I think? I thought that this phone call had just destroyed whatever remaining illusion I had about my son's capacity for love. I thought that he saw me as such an embarrassment that he was willing to pay me to become someone else. I thought that after 5 years of no contact, he'd reached out not because he missed me or needed me, but because he needed me to perform a service for him. I need to think about it, I said. Think about it? Mom, this is important. The meeting is in 2 weeks. I said I need to think about it, David. There was silence on the line, as if he couldn't believe I wasn't immediately agreeing to his request. Okay, he said finally, his voice cooling. But don't take too long. If you can't do this, I need to figure out another solution. Another solution. As if I were just one option among many, easily replaceable if I didn't work out. After he hung up, I sat in my living room for hours, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened. My son was getting married. He wanted me to meet his fiancé's family. But only if I agreed to pretend to be someone else first. The old me, the me from 5 years ago, might have said yes. Might have taken his money and bought new clothes and gotten my hair done and played whatever role he needed me to play. Because that's what I'd always done, molded myself to fit his needs, sacrificed my own dignity for his comfort, prioritized his happiness over my own self-respect. But that woman was gone. The support group, the years of abandonment, the gradual understanding of what I'd allowed myself to become, it had all changed me in ways I was just beginning to understand. I called him back 3 days later. I can't do it, David, I said without preamble. Can't do what? I can't pretend to be someone I'm not to make you look better to your fiancé's family. I won't take your money to buy a costume and play a role. If you're ashamed of who I am, of where you come from, of the woman who raised you, then maybe you shouldn't be getting married to people who would judge you based on your mother's appearance or job title. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I'm not ashamed of you, Mom, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. I just think it would be easier if I pretended to be someone else. Yes, I heard you the first time. You're being dramatic. Am I? David, you called me for the first time in over a year to ask me to buy new clothes and lie about my life so you could impress some people. You offered to pay me like I'm a service you're hiring instead of your mother. How is that not asking me to be someone else? Look, I don't have time for this. If you don't want to help me, fine. I'll figure something else out. Like what? Are you going to hire an actress to play your mother? Are you going to tell them she's dead? What's your backup plan, David? I have to go. Of course you do. You always have to go when the conversation becomes about something other than what you need. He hung up without saying goodbye. That was the last time I spoke to my son before he showed up at my door with his shocking offer. The months that followed our final phone conversation were the loneliest of my life, but also the most liberating. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't waiting for David to call. I wasn't hoping he'd visit. I wasn't making excuses for his behavior or holding on to the fantasy that he'd eventually come back and be the loving son I remembered from his childhood. I was finally, truly alone. And slowly, I began to discover who I was when I wasn't defining myself as David's mother. I started taking better care of myself, not because I hoped he'd notice, but because I deserved care and attention. I joined a book club at the local library. I started taking walks along the East River, enjoying the view of Manhattan's skyline without thinking about how David was somewhere in that forest of buildings, living his successful life without me. I learned to cook for one without feeling lonely, to go to movies by myself without feeling pathetic, to enjoy my own company without constantly wishing someone else was there. Maria, my neighbor from down the hall, became a real friend during this period. She was a widow in her late 60s, originally from Puerto Rico, who'd raised 3 children as a single mother after her husband died in a construction accident. Her children visited regularly, called weekly, included her in their lives and decisions. Watching her family relationships showed me what I'd been missing, but it also showed me what was possible. Mija, she said to me one afternoon as we sat on the building's front steps, watching kids play in the courtyard, you raised your boy with too much love and not enough limits. You taught him that he could take everything and give nothing back. That's not his fault, that's what you taught him. Her words stung, but they were true. I had raised David to see me as inexhaustibly giving, endlessly forgiving, permanently available. I'd never required him to consider my needs, to reciprocate my care, to treat me with the basic respect that any relationship requires to survive. But it's not too late, Maria continued. You can still teach him how to treat you. You just have to be willing to enforce the lesson. I didn't know what she meant then. I thought my relationship with David was over, that there would be no opportunity to teach him anything ever again. I assumed he'd gotten married without me, started his new life with his prominent in-laws, moved forward as if I'd never existed. I was wrong. Last Tuesday morning, I was washing dishes after breakfast when I heard a knock at my door. It was a specific kind of knock, confident, businesslike, impatient. Not the gentle tap of Mrs. Rodriguez or the cheerful rap of the mail carrier. This was the knock of someone who expected their presence to be welcomed, their interruption to be accepted without question. I dried my hands on my dish towel and went to look through the peephole. What I saw made my heart stop. David stood in my hallway, but he looked different. Older, certainly, it had been 5 years since I'd seen him in person. But it was more than that. He looked polished in a way that seemed artificial, like he'd been buffed and molded into someone else's idea of success. His hair was styled differently, shorter and more severe. His clothes were obviously expensive, a navy blue suit that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months, a silk tie, leather shoes so shiny they reflected the hallway's fluorescent lighting. But it was his expression that struck me most. There was a coldness there, a calculation that I'd never seen in my son's face before. He looked like a man who was used to getting what he wanted, who expected cooperation and compliance from everyone around him. I opened the door. "Hello, Mom," he said, not moving to hug me or even step closer. He stayed in the hallway, as if he wasn't sure he wanted to come inside. "David." I couldn't quite believe he was really there. "What are you doing here? I need to talk to you." He glanced past me into the apartment, and I saw something flicker across his face, distaste, maybe, or embarrassment. "May I come in?" I stepped aside to let him enter, watching as he surveyed the small space that had been his home for 18 years. Nothing had changed much since he'd left. The same furniture, the same photos on the walls, the same sense of cramped coziness that comes from making the most of limited space. But seeing it through his eyes, I suddenly noticed things I'd become blind to, the worn patches on the carpet, the way the lamp tilted slightly because its base was cracked, the general shabbiness that comes from not having money to constantly update and replace things. "You look well," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Thank you. So do you." It wasn't exactly true, he looked successful, polished, expensive, but not well. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and a tension in his shoulders that spoke of constant stress. "How's married life?" A shadow crossed his expression. "Actually, that's what I'm here to talk about." He didn't sit down, even though I gestured toward the couch. Instead, he stood in the middle of my living room, hands clasped behind his back, looking like he was preparing to deliver a business presentation. "Amanda and I are having some problems," he said. "It turns out her family wasn't as accepting as I thought they'd be. They've been difficult about my background." My background. As if I were something that had happened to him rather than the person who'd created him, raised him, shaped everything good that he'd ever been. "They've made it clear that they consider me beneath their daughter's station," he continued. "Her father has been particularly vocal about his concerns. He thinks Amanda could do better." I waited for him to continue, not sure where this conversation was heading but certain it wasn't going to end with an apology or a reconciliation. "The situation has put a strain on my marriage, and it's starting to affect my business relationships as well. Amanda's family has connections I need, contracts that could take my company to the next level. But their disapproval of me is making everything complicated. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. There was a part of me, a part one wasn't proud of, that felt a bitter satisfaction knowing that David's attempt to elevate himself above his origins hadn't gone as smoothly as planned. I've been thinking about our situation, he said, and the way he phrased it, our situation, made me realize he was about to make this somehow my responsibility. And I think I have a solution that could benefit both of us. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, thick and cream-colored, obviously expensive. I'm prepared to offer you a very generous sum, $250,000, if you'll agree to sign a legal document. I stared at the envelope, not understanding. What kind of legal document? It's a formal renunciation of our relationship, he said calmly, as if he were discussing the weather. Essentially, you'd be agreeing to legally give up any claim to being my mother. No contact, no public acknowledgement, no attempt to reconnect in the future. In exchange, you'd receive enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward, gripping the back of my armchair for support. I know it sounds harsh, he continued, apparently mistaking my shock for hesitation, but think about what this could mean for you. You could move somewhere warmer, maybe Arizona or Florida. You could stop working, stop worrying about money, stop living in this. He gestured around my apartment, his distaste obvious. You could have a real retirement. In exchange for pretending you were never born, I whispered. In exchange for both of us moving on with our lives, he corrected. Mom, let's be honest here. We haven't had a real relationship in years. You've been getting along fine without me, and I've built a life that doesn't include you. This would just make it official. I looked at my son, this stranger in expensive clothes standing in my living room, offering me money to disappear from his life permanently. This man who'd grown from the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd cried when his goldfish died, who'd made me construction paper flowers every Mother's Day. You want me to sell you your freedom, I said. I want to offer you yours, he replied. Mom, you've spent your whole life taking care of other people. When's the last time you did something just for yourself? When's the last time you went on vacation, bought something expensive just because you wanted it, lived without constantly worrying about money? He was trying to make himself sound generous, as if he were doing me a favor. But I could see the calculation behind his offer. His in-laws couldn't disapprove of a background that legally didn't exist. He couldn't be judged for having a working-class mother if he could prove he'd severed all ties with her. How long have you been planning this? I asked. What do you mean? This offer? This legal document? How long have you been working on a way to erase me from your life? He had the decency to look uncomfortable. It's not about erasing you, Mom. It's about, answer the question, David. How long? A few months, he admitted. Since the situation with Amanda's family got more serious. A few months. While I'd been learning to live without him, he'd been consulting lawyers about how to make my absence official. While I'd been coming to terms with his abandonment, he'd been calculating the exact dollar amount he was willing to pay to make that abandonment permanent and legal. I walked to my kitchen table and sat down heavily. The envelope lay between us like a weapon. What if I say no? I asked. Then nothing changes, he said, but I could hear the irritation in his voice. You continue living here, I continue living my life, and we continue having no contact. Except now you'll also continue worrying about money and working until you're too old to work anymore. The threat was subtle but clear. This was my one chance to benefit from our relationship. If I refused his offer, I'd have nothing, no son, no financial security, no hope of anything changing. But something had changed in me during those 5 years of silence. Something fundamental had shifted during those months of learning to live for myself instead of for someone else's approval. The woman who'd raised David, who'd sacrificed her retirement to fund his dreams, who'd spent years hoping for crumbs of affection from him, that woman might have taken his money. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I stood up and walked to the envelope. David's eyes followed me, and I could see the certainty in his expression. He believed I would take his offer. He'd calculated my desperation, my loneliness, my financial situation, and he was confident that $250,000 would be enough to buy his freedom from me. I picked up the envelope and held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Then I walked to the trash can and dropped it in. No, I said. David's mouth fell open. No, David. I won't take your money, and I won't sign your document. Mom, be reasonable. This is a lot of money. More than you'll ever have another chance at. I don't want your money. Then what do you want? It was such a simple question, but it took me a moment to find the answer. What did I want from this stranger who used to be my son? I want you to leave, I said finally. Leave? But we haven't finished discussing. Yes, we have. You came here to buy your way out of having a mother. I'm not for sale. There's nothing left to discuss. He stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. You're making a mistake, Mom. You'll regret this. Maybe. But it'll be my mistake to make. David stood there for another long moment, clearly trying to decide whether to argue further or accept defeat. Finally, he shook his head and walked toward the door. This is why Amanda's family has problems with my background, he said, his voice turning cruel. They can smell the desperation, the neediness. They know exactly what kind of person raised me. The words were designed to hurt, to make me doubt my decision, to drive me back to the trash can to retrieve his envelope. But they had the opposite effect. They showed me exactly who my son had become, and exactly why I was right to refuse his offer. Goodbye, David, I said. He stopped with his hand on the doorknob. If you change your mind, I won't. The offer won't stay open forever. Good. He left without another word, and I was alone again in my small apartment. But this time, the loneliness felt different. It felt like freedom. I sat in my living room for a long time after he'd gone, processing what had just happened. My son had offered me $250,000 to legally cease being his mother. He'd calculated the exact price of my disappearance from his life. He'd come to my home, looked around at my modest circumstances, and assumed I was desperate enough to accept any offer that would improve my financial situation. He'd been wrong. Not because I didn't need the money, I did. Not because his offer wasn't tempting, it was. But because I'd finally learned something that had taken me 72 years to understand: some things can't be sold, and some prices are too high to pay. I was still David's mother, whether he wanted to acknowledge it or not. That wasn't a legal designation that could be revoked by a document. It wasn't a business relationship that could be terminated with the right severance package. It was a biological and historical fact that no amount of money could change. But more importantly, I was my own person. I had value that wasn't dependent on his recognition or approval. I had worth that couldn't be measured in dollars or determined by how useful I was to someone else. I had dignity, and dignity isn't for sale. The realization felt like waking up from a long, strange dream. For the first time in years, I felt clear about who I was and what I deserved. I deserved to be treated with respect. I deserved to be valued for who I was, not what I could provide. I deserved love that didn't come with conditions or require me to pretend to be someone else. David couldn't give me those things. Maybe he never could have, even when he was young. Maybe I'd raised him in a way that made it impossible for him to see me as anything more than a source of support and resources. Maybe his father's abandonment had damaged his ability to form genuine emotional connections. Maybe his success had changed him in ways that made love seem like weakness and family feel like liability. It didn't matter anymore. I couldn't change what he'd become, but I could change how I responded to it. I walked to the trash can and looked at the envelope lying among my kitchen scraps and coffee grounds. For just a moment, I considered retrieving it. $250,000 was indeed more money than I'd ever see again. It could solve all my financial problems, give me security and comfort for the rest of my life. But it would also mean accepting that I was worth nothing more than the price David was willing to pay to be rid of me. It would mean agreeing that our relationship had been a business transaction rather than a family bond. It would mean spending whatever years I had left knowing that I'd sold my identity as a mother for the right amount of money. I left the envelope in the trash. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking constantly about David's offer and my decision to refuse it. Part of me wondered if I'd been foolish, if I'd let pride cost me the chance for financial security. But a larger part of me felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pride in myself. I'd stood up to someone who'd taken me for granted for decades. I'd refused to be bought, manipulated, or diminished. I'd chosen dignity over money, self-respect over security. It felt like the first truly independent decision I'd made since David was born. Maria knocked on my door 3 days after David's visit. She took one look at my face and immediately knew something significant had happened. "Mija, you look different," she said as I let her in. "What's going on?" I told her everything. David's visit, his offer, my refusal. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more incredulous with each detail. "Dios mío," she breathed when I finished. "He wanted to pay you to stop being his mother?" $250,000, I confirmed. "And you said no?" I said no. She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Then she broke into a wide smile and pulled me into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," she said. "So proud. That boy has no idea what he just lost." Her words brought tears to my eyes, but they were different tears than I'd cried over David before. These weren't tears of sadness or longing or regret. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of finally being seen and understood by someone who mattered. But what if I made the wrong choice? I asked her. What if this was my only chance to have enough money to really be okay? Maggie, she said, gripping my hands in hers, money isn't the only way to be okay. Respect is okay. Dignity is okay. Knowing who you are and standing up for it is okay. Your boy offered to pay you to disappear because he's ashamed of where he came from. But where he came from is you, and you're worth more than any amount of money he could offer. She was right. I knew she was right. But knowing something and feeling it are different things, and it took time for the emotional reality to catch up with the intellectual understanding. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took the subway into Manhattan and walked through Central Park. It was October, and the leaves were just starting to change colors. The air was crisp and clean, and the park was full of families enjoying the beautiful weather. I found myself at the zoo, standing in front of the same exhibit where David and I had posed for that photograph almost 20 years ago. The sea lions were still there, barking and playing in their pool, delighting a new generation of children. I watched a little boy, maybe 8 years old, press his face against the glass while his mother laughed and took pictures. The sight should have made me sad, should have reminded me of everything I'd lost with David. Instead, I felt something unexpected, gratitude. I'd had those moments once. I'd been that laughing mother, taking pictures of my amazed child. David's current inability to love me couldn't erase the fact that we'd once shared genuine joy together. More importantly, his rejection couldn't erase my capacity to experience joy on my own. I was standing in Central Park on a beautiful autumn day, watching children discover wonder, feeling the sun on my face and the breeze in my hair. I was alive, healthy, free to go where I wanted and do what I pleased. I had friends who cared about me, a community that knew and accepted me, enough money to meet my basic needs even if I didn't have luxury. I had a good life. Maybe not the life I'd imagined when David was young and I thought we'd always be close. But a good life nonetheless. Walking home that day, I made a decision that surprised me. I was going to take some of the money I'd been saving and do something completely self-indulgent. I was going to book a trip somewhere I'd always wanted to go but had never felt I could afford. I'd always dreamed of seeing the ocean in California, walking along those beaches I'd seen in movies and magazines. I'd saved almost $3,000 from my pension checks over the past 2 years, money I'd been keeping for emergencies or unexpected expenses. But maybe this was an emergency of a different kind. Maybe after decades of putting everyone else's needs first, it was time for me to have something I wanted just because I wanted it. I called a travel agent the next morning and booked a week-long trip to San Diego for November. The cost was more than I usually spent on myself in 6 months, but for the first time in my life, that felt completely appropriate. You're going to love it there, the travel agent told me. The weather's beautiful, the beaches are gorgeous, and there's so much to see and do. As I hung up the phone, I felt a flutter of excitement in my chest. When was the last time I'd felt excited about something that was just for me? When was the last time I'd looked forward to an experience that didn't involve taking care of someone else or meeting someone else's needs? I couldn't remember. The weeks leading up to my trip were filled with small preparations that brought me unexpected pleasure. I bought new clothes, not expensive outfits, but things that made me feel comfortable and confident. I got my hair cut and styled in a way I'd been wanting to try for years but had never felt was worth the expense. I researched restaurants and attractions, making lists of things I wanted to see and do. For the first time in decades, I was planning something that was entirely about my own happiness. The night before my flight, Maria came over to see me off. She brought a bottle of wine and we sat in my living room, toasting my adventure. "I can't believe you're really doing this," she said, grinning. "When I first moved to this building 15 years ago, you were already so focused on that boy. I never saw you do anything that wasn't about him somehow." She was right. Even my hobbies, my friendships, my choices about how to spend my time, everything had been filtered through the question of how it would affect David, what he would think, whether it would interfere with my ability to help him when he needed it. I don't think I knew how to want things for myself, I admitted. I'd been taking care of other people for so long that I forgot I was a person who deserved care too. And now? Now I'm going to walk on a beach in California and eat fish tacos and watch the sunset over the Pacific Ocean. And I'm going to do it all just because it makes me happy. The flight to San Diego was my first time on an airplane in over 20 years. As we lifted off from LaGuardia, I pressed my face to the window and watched New York grow smaller beneath me. Somewhere down there, David was going about his successful life, probably forgetting that he'd ever had a mother who'd refused his offer. The thought didn't hurt the way it would have a few months ago. Instead, it felt like freedom. The week in California was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. I walked along the beaches at sunrise and sunset, feeling the sand between my toes and the salt air in my lungs. I ate at little restaurants overlooking the ocean, trying foods I'd never tasted before. I visited museums and gardens, took a harbor cruise, spent an entire afternoon just sitting on a bench, reading and people watching. But the most profound moment came on my 4th day there. I was walking along La Jolla Cove, watching seals bask on the rocks, when a family approached. A grandmother was walking with her adult daughter and grandson, and the little boy was excited about seeing the seals. "Grandma, look," he called out. "They're so funny." The grandmother laughed and lifted him up so he could see better. "They are funny, aren't they? Just like big dogs that learned how to swim." The daughter took photos of her mother and son together, both of them laughing and pointing at the seals. It was such a simple scene, but it showed me something I'd been missing. This was what family relationships could look like: mutual affection, shared joy, genuine connection between generations. I'd never had that with David, not even when he was young. Our relationship had always been about my giving and his taking, my sacrificing and his benefiting. Even his childhood affection had come with expectations that I would provide, protect, prioritize his needs above my own. But watching this family, I realized that wasn't the only way to love or be loved. There were relationships based on mutual respect, shared interests, genuine care that flowed in both directions. I'd just never learned how to create or maintain them. Standing on that beach, watching 3 generations enjoy each other's company, I made a promise to myself. I was going to learn. I was going to figure out how to have relationships that nourished me as much as I nourished them. I was going to stop accepting scraps of affection from people who saw me as useful rather than valuable. When I returned to Queens the following week, I felt like a different person. The apartment looked exactly the same, but I saw it with new eyes. Instead of a place where I'd waited for David to call or visit, it was now simply my home. Instead of a reminder of all the dreams that hadn't worked out, it was a space I could make entirely my own. I started small. I rearranged the furniture, moving David's photo from the prominent spot on my dresser to a less central location on a bookshelf. I bought new curtains and a colorful throw pillow for my couch. I framed some of the photos I'd taken in California and hung them on my walls. More significantly, I started saying yes to invitations I'd previously declined. Maria had been asking me for months to join her weekly card game with some other women from the building. I'd always found excuses: I was tired, I needed to clean, I was waiting for a phone call that never came. But now I said yes, and discovered that I actually enjoyed the company and conversation. I also started volunteering at the local library, reading to children during their storytime sessions. The first time I sat in that circle of 5- and 6-year-olds, watching their faces light up as I read about brave mice and clever rabbits, I felt a joy I hadn't experienced since David was very young. These children appreciated my presence without expecting anything more from me. They laughed at the funny voices I made for different characters, gasped at exciting plot twists, and thanked me sincerely when story time ended. For the first time in years, I felt useful in a way that was genuinely fulfilling rather than depleting. The holidays approached, Thanksgiving first, then Christmas, and for the first time in 5 years, I didn't spend weeks beforehand hoping David would call. I made plans with Maria and some other friends from the neighborhood. We cooked together, shared stories, watched old movies, and created new traditions that had nothing to do with family obligation and everything to do with chosen connection. On Christmas morning, I woke up not to disappointment about gifts that wouldn't come or calls that wouldn't be made, but to anticipation about the day ahead. I was having dinner with Maria's family, and her daughter had specifically asked me to bring my famous apple pie, a recipe I'd perfected during David's childhood but hadn't made for anyone in years. As I rolled out the pie crust in my kitchen, humming Christmas carols and looking forward to an evening of warmth and laughter with people who actually wanted me there, I realized that this was the first Christmas in decades where I felt genuinely happy rather than just trying to make the best of disappointment. 3 months after my trip to California, 6 months after David's shocking offer, I was a different person living a different life. Not dramatically different, I still lived in the same apartment, still survived on the same pension, still dealt with the same aches and pains that come with being 72 years old. But internally, fundamentally, everything had changed. I no longer defined myself primarily as David's mother. I was Margaret, a woman with interests and friendships and plans that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or approval. I was someone who took trips and tried new restaurants and laughed with friends and contributed to her community. I was someone whose worth wasn't dependent on how useful she was to other people. Most importantly, I was someone who had learned the difference between love and enablement, between sacrifice and self-destruction, between family loyalty and allowing yourself to be diminished by people who should protect and cherish you. The test of that new understanding came in March, almost a year after David's visit. I was at the library, setting up for afternoon story time, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it. Mrs. Patterson? The voice was unfamiliar, professional, slightly hesitant. This is Margaret Patterson. My name is Amanda Patterson. I think I'm your daughter-in-law. David's wife. The woman I'd never met, whose family had found my son's background so unacceptable that he'd been willing to pay me to disappear rather than deal with their judgment. Hello, Amanda, I said carefully. I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from David's old phone records. He doesn't know I'm calling you. I waited, not sure what she could possibly want from me. I wanted to talk to you about what happened, she continued. About David's offer. He told me about it, and I was horrified. This was unexpected. He told you? He told me because he was proud of it, she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. He thought it was clever, a clean solution to a complicated problem. He has no idea how awful it was. I found myself curious despite the pain this conversation was bringing up. Why are you calling me, Amanda? Because I've been thinking about it for months, and I can't stop being disgusted by what he did. And because I wanted you to know that not everyone in his life thinks you're something to be ashamed of. Her words were kind, but they also confirmed what I'd already suspected, that David had indeed been ashamed of me, ashamed enough that he'd seen paying me to disappear as reasonable rather than monstrous. I want you to know, Amanda continued, that my parents' attitude toward David's background had nothing to do with you specifically. They don't even know you. They just have very rigid ideas about social class and appropriate marriages. Their disapproval says everything about them and nothing about you. Thank you for saying that, I said, and meant it. But you should also know that I don't blame you for David's choices. He's a grown man responsible for his own decisions. I know. But I also know that I could have handled my family's objections differently. I could have defended him more strongly, or even told them that their approval wasn't necessary for my happiness. Instead, I let their attitude create pressure that David felt he had to resolve by doing what he did to you. She was crying now, and I found myself feeling sorry for her. She was married to my son, which meant she was learning the same lesson I'd learned over many years, that David was skilled at making other people responsible for solving problems that were actually his to face. Amanda, I said gently, you're not responsible for what David offered me, or for my decision to refuse it. Those were choices between him and me. But I am responsible for staying married to someone who would make that kind of offer, she said. I've been thinking about that for months too. I understood what she wasn't quite saying. David's willingness to legally disown his mother for money had shown her something about his character that she was struggling to accept. What are you going to do? I asked. I don't know yet. But I wanted you to know that you made the right choice. What he offered you wasn't generosity, it was selfishness. And anyone who would ask their mother to sign away their relationship for any amount of money isn't someone who deserves to have a mother's love. After we hung up, I sat in the library's children's section, surrounded by bright picture books and tiny chairs, processing the conversation. David's wife had called to apologize for something that wasn't her fault and to validate a choice I'd already made peace with. More than that, she'd confirmed that my refusal to accept his offer had revealed something about his character that was affecting other relationships in his life. I felt sorry for Amanda, but I also felt something unexpected, relief that I'd chosen dignity over money. If I'd accepted David's offer, I'd be spending my remaining years knowing that my son had wanted me gone enough to pay for it, and that I'd agreed to disappear for the right price. Instead, I could spend those years knowing that when tested, I'd chosen self-respect over financial security. That evening, I called Maria and told her about Amanda's call. That poor girl, Maria said. She's learning what you learned, that your son isn't who she thought he was. I hope she makes better choices than I did, I said. I hope she doesn't spend 30 years trying to love someone who isn't capable of loving her back. You did make better choices, eventually, Maria pointed out. It just took you longer to learn the lesson. She was right. I had learned the lesson, and applied it, and my life was better for it. David was still my son biologically, but he was no longer the center of my world, the focus of my hopes, the measure of my worth as a person. He was just someone I used to love who had grown into someone I couldn't respect. And that was okay. It was sad, but it was okay. I'd grieved the loss of the relationship I'd wanted with him, and I'd moved on to build relationships that actually nourished me rather than depleting me. 6 months later, Amanda called me again. She and David were getting divorced. She'd tried marriage counseling, individual therapy, long conversations about values and priorities, but ultimately she couldn't stay married to someone who'd been willing to pay his mother to legally stop being his mother. He still doesn't understand why what he did was wrong, she told me. He keeps saying it was a generous offer, that you were foolish to refuse it, that he was trying to help both of us move on with our lives. He genuinely can't see why I found his behavior appalling. I wasn't surprised. The man who'd stood in my living room a year ago, offering me money to disappear, had shown no awareness that his proposal was cruel or inappropriate. He'd seemed genuinely confused by my refusal, as if he couldn't imagine why anyone would choose dignity over cash. I'm sorry your marriage didn't work out, I told Amanda, and I meant it. I'm not, she said. I'm sorry I wasted 2 years trying to love someone who sees relationships as transactions. But I'm not sorry to be getting out before we had children and I had to watch him treat them the way he treated you. After that conversation, I realized that David's offer hadn't just revealed his character to me, it had been a revelation for everyone in his life who learned about it. His wife had left him. Who knew what his business associates, his friends, his social circle would think if they knew he'd tried to buy his way out of having a mother? I felt no satisfaction in his apparent consequences, but I felt confirmation that my choice had been right. The man who'd offered me that money wasn't someone whose approval I should have been seeking all those years. He wasn't someone whose love was worth the sacrifices I'd made. He'd grown into someone whose values were so different from mine that we might as well have been strangers. And in many ways, we were. Now, 2 years after David's visit, as I sit in my living room watching the sun set over Queens, I can say with complete honesty that I'm happier than I've been in decades. Not because my life is easy or luxurious, it's not. Not because I found perfect love or friendship, I haven't. But because I found something more valuable than either of those things, I found myself. I know who I am when I'm not trying to earn someone else's love. I know what I enjoy when I'm not constantly worried about someone else's needs. I know what I'm capable of when I'm not pouring all my energy into relationships that only flow one direction. I'm capable of joy that doesn't depend on anyone else's mood. I'm capable of contentment that isn't threatened by other people's disapproval. I'm capable of love that isn't desperate or needy or conditional on being reciprocated. Most importantly, I've learned that it's possible to grieve a relationship while celebrating your freedom from it. I can be sad about what David and I never had while being grateful for what I've gained since accepting that we'll never have it. I can mourn the mother-son bond one dreamed of while appreciating the peace that comes from no longer trying to force that dream into reality. The photograph of 8-year-old David still sits on my bookshelf, but now when I look at it, I see something different. I don't see the promise of eternal love or the foundation of an unbreakable bond. I see a moment in time when a little boy and his mother were happy together, and I'm grateful I had that moment rather than sad that it didn't last forever. Everything ends. Every relationship changes. Every dream either comes true or it doesn't. The question isn't whether you'll face disappointment in love, you will. The question is whether you'll learn from that disappointment or let it define you. For too many years, I let David's emotional absence define me. I became smaller and needier and more desperate with each year of his neglect. I allowed his inability to love me to convince me that I wasn't worthy of love. I mistook his selfishness for my failure, his emotional limitations for my inadequacy. But his offer to buy me out of his life was such a shock, such an obvious cruelty, that it finally woke me up to what I'd been accepting. A son who loved me, even imperfectly, wouldn't have tried to pay me to disappear. A son who respected me, even minimally, wouldn't have assumed I could be bought. A son who saw me as a person rather than a problem wouldn't have thought money could solve the inconvenience of my existence. His offer revealed not just his character, but mine. And I discovered that my character was stronger than I'd known, more valuable than I'd believed, more deserving of respect than I'd demanded. I learned that I'd rather be alone with my dignity than connected to someone who saw me as disposable. I'd rather struggle financially than compromise my self-worth. I'd rather face an uncertain future than accept certain humiliation. Those were hard lessons to learn at 72, but they weren't too late to learn. I had years ahead of me, maybe decades, to live as the woman I'd discovered I was rather than the woman I'd thought I had to be. And what a woman she turned out to be. Stronger than I'd imagined. Braver than I'd believed. More interesting, more capable, more worthy of respect than I'd ever given myself credit for. I think about the support group that helped me understand the difference between love and enabling. I think about Maria, whose friendship showed me what mutual care looks like. I think about the children at the library, whose faces light up when I read to them, who appreciate my presence without expecting me to sacrifice myself for their benefit. I think about walks along the East River, meals shared with friends, quiet evenings spent reading or listening to music or just enjoying my own company. I think about future trips I want to take, projects I want to try, experiences I want to have just because they interest me. This is what I gained when I lost David, I gained myself. If you're listening to this story and seeing pieces of your own life in it, I want you to know something. You don't have to accept love that comes with conditions. You don't have to be grateful for crumbs from people who should be offering you full meals. You don't have to prove your worth by accepting less than you deserve. Family relationships, like all relationships, should be based on mutual respect and genuine affection. When they're not, when they become exercises in one person giving and the other person taking, they're not relationships at all. They're arrangements that benefit one party at the expense of the other. You have the right to expect better. You have the right to demand respect. You have the right to say no to people who see you as useful rather than valuable, even if those people share your DNA. Most importantly, you have the right to discover who you are when you're not trying to earn someone else's love. You might be surprised by what you find. You might discover that you're stronger, braver, more interesting, more worthy of care than you ever imagined. The hardest part isn't learning these lessons, it's applying them. It's choosing dignity over familiarity, self-respect over false hope, uncertain independence over certain diminishment. But I can tell you from experience that it's worth it. The peace that comes from living authentically, the joy that comes from relationships that actually nourish you, the confidence that comes from knowing you won't accept less than you deserve, these things are worth any sacrifice, any uncertainty, any fear. David's offer taught me that some prices are too high to pay and some things aren't for sale. My dignity wasn't for sale. My identity as a worthy person wasn't for sale. My right to exist in his world wasn't something I should have had to purchase. When he offered me money to disappear, he thought he was solving a problem. Instead, he was creating a solution, not to his problem, but to mine. He showed me exactly who he was and exactly what I meant to him, and that clarity freed me to choose a different path. I chose the path that led me to myself. And it's been the most rewarding journey of my life. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where you were giving everything and receiving nothing? Have you ever loved someone who saw you as useful rather than valuable? Has anyone ever made you feel like your worth was conditional on what you could provide for them? If any of this sounds familiar, I want you to know that you're not alone. And more importantly, I want you to know that you have choices you might not have considered. You don't have to keep accepting less than you deserve. You don't have to keep hoping that people who've shown you their character will suddenly become different. You don't have to keep sacrificing yourself for people who wouldn't sacrifice anything for you. You can choose yourself. You can choose dignity. You can choose to find out who you are when you're not trying to earn love from people who aren't capable of giving it. It's never too late to make that choice. I was 72 when I finally learned this lesson, and I still had time to transform my life completely. Whatever your age, whatever your circumstances, you still have time to choose a different path. The path that leads to yourself is always available. And the person you'll find at the end of that path, stronger, wiser, more worthy of love than you ever imagined, is waiting for you to begin the journey. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched something in your heart, if it reminded you of your own experiences or someone you know who needs to hear this message, please share it. Like this video and subscribe to help these stories reach people who need them. Your story matters too. Your worth is not negotiable. Your dignity is not for sale. And you are never too old, never too late, never too lost to find your way back to yourself.